Uganda's military leadership is reportedly ready to commit troops to support Israel in a potential conflict with Iran. Think about what that sentence means. A country with one of Africa's highest poverty rates, where infrastructure crumbles, where young people flee for survival, is considering deploying its soldiers to fight in a war thousands of miles away, in a region that has no direct security threat to Kampala. This is not a hypothetical. This is a moment where the entire architecture of African geopolitics, how nations prioritize, where they allocate resources, whose battles they choose to fight, is being exposed in real time. And the implications extend far beyond Uganda. What we're witnessing is a cascade of decisions shaped by religion, historical alignment, colonial hangover, and great power competition, each layer adding weight to the same fundamental question. Who decides what matters for Africa? And more urgently, who pays the price when those decisions are made elsewhere? To understand why Uganda's military would even consider such a move requires stepping back into the post-Cold War architecture of the Middle East and how Africa fits, or doesn't fit, into that picture. Israel is a nuclear power. It has extraordinary military capability, advanced intelligence networks, and strategic depth in the region. But it also has existential anxieties about Iran. Those anxieties are not paranoia. Iran has explicitly called for Israel's destruction. Iran funds proxy militias across the Levant, the Gulf, and North Africa. The hostility is structural, not rhetorical theater. The United States, Israel's closest military and political ally, has spent decades containing Iran through sanctions, through proxy wars, through blockades, through assassination, through sabotage. This is not secret. This is the operational framework of American foreign policy in the Middle East for the last 2 decades. And that strategy has been working, in a sense. Iran's economy is devastated, its currency is worthless, its people are suffering. But containment has not eliminated Iran. It has hardened it. And over the past few years, as Iranian militias have become more active, striking American bases, attacking Israeli interests, threatening shipping routes, the calculus has shifted toward something more direct. What we're seeing now, according to multiple reports and assessments, is a slow-motion escalation toward direct military confrontation. American forces are building up in the region. Israel is conducting strikes on Iranian targets. Iran is strengthening its proxy networks and its own military posture. And suddenly, countries like Uganda are receiving quiet overtures asking, "Will you send troops if this goes hot?" Why Uganda? Uganda sits at a crossroads. It has military capability, battle-hardened troops with experience in Somalia, in Kenya, in regional peacekeeping operations. It has Islamic history and Christian dominance, which complicates its position in Middle Eastern politics. It has a young population hungry for resources and opportunity. And it has a military leadership that has historically aligned with American and Western interests. But here is where the narrative fractures. Uganda's military is not poor because of bad luck. The Ugandan state is not underdeveloped because of random historical misfortune. Uganda faces acute resource constraints, crumbling infrastructure, limited healthcare, and endemic poverty because its political and military leadership has systematically prioritized other concerns. Military corruption, misallocation of budget, the diversion of resources to power consolidation and personal enrichment. These are the machinery that keeps Uganda poor while its soldiers are considered valuable enough to export to foreign wars. The speaker in our input frames this bluntly. Uganda's military, by considering Israeli alignment, is engaging in mental colonization, a condition where African leaders internalize the priorities and perspectives of external powers so completely that they mistake foreign interests for their own. This is worth examining carefully, because the accusation carries historical weight. During the Cold War, Africa was a theater. The Soviet Union and the United States competed for influence across the continent, arming different sides of conflicts, backing different governments, turning local disputes into proxy battles. That era formally ended in 1991, but its logic never truly disappeared. What changed was the language used to justify it. Where the Cold War used ideology, communism versus capitalism, The contemporary era uses religion, culture, and civilization. Israel is framed as the West's democratic ally in the Middle East. Iran is framed as a theocratic rival. And African nations with Christian majorities or Western alignments are told, explicitly or implicitly, that supporting Israel is natural, that opposing Iran is automatic, that these are extensions of their own values rather than choices made in someone else's interests. But the material reality is far starker. Uganda is not threatened by Iran. Uganda has no territorial disputes with Iran. Uganda has no religious duty to support Israel. What Uganda has is a history of receiving American military aid, of participating in American-aligned coalitions, and of leadership that has learned to interpret American strategic priorities as its own. The deeper problem, which the speaker identifies, is that this pattern reproduces itself. When Uganda commits troops to a war in the Middle East, those troops are not available for border security, for internal stability, for training and development. When Uganda's military budget is stretched thin fighting Israel's enemies, that money is not going to rural health care or agricultural development or education. The opportunity cost is not invisible, it is catastrophic. And the trigger for this cost is not rooted in Uganda's own calculations. It is rooted in Washington's calculations. It is rooted in Tel Aviv's calculations. It is rooted, ultimately, in the global strategic competition between the United States and Iran for hegemonic influence in a region Uganda has no stake in controlling. Now we arrive at the second layer of this crisis, the economic consequences radiating outward from Middle Eastern conflict. The Middle East is not important to global economics because of its political intrigue. It is important because it controls a significant portion of the world's oil and natural gas. The Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 21% of the world's petroleum trade passes, is in the Persian Gulf. If a war between Israel and Iran disrupts shipping through that corridor, if oil production facilities are damaged, if tankers are attacked, the price of oil spikes globally within weeks. Here is the cascade. When oil prices spike, transportation costs rise. When transportation costs rise, the cost of shipping food, medicine, fertilizer, and manufactured goods increases. When those costs increase, inflation ripples through economies that have little pricing power. For developing nations in Africa, nations that import most of their food and fuel, those price spikes are not abstract economic phenomena. They are hunger. They are blackouts. They are the closure of schools and clinics because there is no fuel to operate them. Uganda has experienced this directly. In 2022, when Russia invaded Ukraine and global oil markets convulsed, Uganda's inflation spiked to over 10%. The currency depreciated. Food prices doubled in many categories. The poor bore the brunt of this shock because they spend the highest proportion of their income on food and fuel, the exact commodities most vulnerable to global commodity price volatility. A new war in the Middle East, one involving direct strikes on Iranian oil infrastructure, could produce an even sharper shock. And Uganda would experience that shock not as a participant in a strategic calculation, but as a victim of one. This is the perverse logic of the situation. Uganda's military considers supporting Israel partly because of security partnership with the United States. That partnership brings aid, training, and a sense of strategic importance. But that same partnership entangles Uganda in American strategic interests in regions thousands of miles away. And when those strategic interests collide with Iran, a collision increasingly likely given the current trajectory. Uganda's population will pay the price through rising prices, economic instability, and resource scarcity, regardless of whether Uganda itself participates in the war. The speaker makes this point sharply. African leaders ignore domestic challenges while pledging commitment to foreign conflicts. But the domestic challenges are not separate from the foreign conflicts. They are linked. The resource constraints that prevent Uganda from building hospitals are partly structural. Uganda's taxation capacity, its productive base, its human capital development. But they are also partly political budget decisions that prioritize military spending for external commitments over internal development. If Uganda's military is preparing for deployment to the Middle East, that is a resource decision. That is training time, fuel, ammunition, and most importantly, political attention that could be directed elsewhere. It is a statement of priority that says, our obligation to an external power supersedes our obligation to our own people. Let us now examine the question of religion more directly, because it appears in the input and it is undeniably part of this narrative, but it requires precision to avoid caricature. Uganda is a country with deep Christian roots, about 85% Christian and 15% Muslim. The military hierarchy reflects this demographic reality. Most senior commanders are Christian. Israel, as a Jewish state, has cultivated relationships with Christian-majority nations in sub-Saharan Africa for decades. There is a theological component to this. Some evangelical Christian theology sees support for Israel as religiously significant, as connected to biblical prophecy or divine favor. And there is a political component. Christian-majority nations can more easily rally domestic support for alignment with Israel without facing accusations of religious preference that Muslim-majority nations might face. But here is the critical distinction. Religion is not the primary driver of this alignment. Religion is the language through which a fundamentally strategic interest is being justified. Israel needs allies. It is surrounded by states that range from hostile to neutral. It has extraordinary military capability, but limited demographic weight and limited regional legitimacy beyond its core Western allies. Building relationships with African nations, including Christian-majority nations, serves Israel's interest in widening its diplomatic footprint and creating the impression of global support beyond the Western bubble. This is strategic calculation dressed in theological language. Similarly, the United States uses Christian identity as a bridge for alliance building in Africa. American evangelical Christianity, which has massive influence in sub-Saharan African churches, often emphasizes support for Israel as a Christian value. This creates an ideological alignment that American policymakers can leverage. It is not that American officials believe American security depends on Uganda's Christianity. It is that they understand that Uganda's Christian identity can be a pathway to Uganda's alignment with American strategic priorities. This is what the speaker means by mental colonization. It is not that Uganda's leaders are irrational or foolish. It is that they have internalized a framework where alignment with distant powers, justified through religion or history or strategic partnership, is presented as natural and inevitable rather than as a choice that comes with costs. The historical parallel is instructive. During the decolonization era, African nations inherited borders, institutions, and diplomatic frameworks designed by colonial powers. A nation's relationships were often inherited from the colonial metropole rather than chosen based on African interests. That formal colonialism ended, but the underlying logic that Africa's role is to serve as a strategic terrain for non-African powers never fully disappeared. When Uganda's military considers aligning with Israel in a war with Iran, it is not making a sovereign decision based on Uganda's interests. It is participating in a system where African nations are still treated as terrain, as resources, as auxiliary forces in someone else's strategic game. The language of partnership and alliance can obscure this. But the material reality is clear. Uganda would be paying a price in soldiers' lives, in military resources, in economic stability, for a conflict whose resolution does not depend on Uganda's participation and whose causes do not threaten Uganda's security. Now let us zoom out to the broader question of American-Iranian competition and how it is reshaping global stability. The United States and Iran are engaged in what can only be described as a slow-motion confrontation whose logic has become increasingly divorced from any clear strategic objective. The United States wanted regime change in Iran in 2003. It did not achieve it, and 2 decades of sanctions, military presence, and proxy warfare later, Iran still stands. Iran wanted to eliminate Israel. It has not come close, and its proxies have been systematically degraded by Israeli intelligence operations. Both sides are strong enough that they cannot eliminate each other. Neither is willing to accept the other's survival as legitimate. This is the definition of an unresolvable conflict. And unresolvable conflicts, when they involve nuclear-capable powers and global economic choke points, have a tendency to metastasize. What we are seeing now is a shift in the form that confrontation takes. For years, it was indirect: proxy warfare, cyber operations, assassinations, economic warfare through sanctions. But the intensity has been increasing. Iranian missiles are becoming more sophisticated. Israeli strikes on Iranian targets are becoming more direct. American military presence in the Gulf is expanding. The threshold for escalation is lowering. The speaker identifies a key point. Military buildup and shifting war objectives are creating global instability. This is precise. The United States has been conducting a military buildup in the Gulf region, positioning forces and weapon systems in ways that suggest preparation for a larger conflict. Israel has been conducting strikes on Iranian targets with increasing frequency and openness, in ways that suggest less concern about the diplomatic consequences. And Iran has been strengthening its missile capabilities and its proxy networks in ways that suggest preparation for a confrontation it sees as increasingly inevitable. At each step, there are reasons for the actions, but collectively, they add up to a spiral, where each side's defensive preparations look like offensive preparations to the other side, triggering further military buildup, further strategic hedging, further moves up the escalation ladder. The critical point is that this escalation is not inevitable. It is not the result of immutable hatred or unstoppable historical forces. It is the result of choices made by political leadership in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran. Those choices are shaped by domestic politics, by military-industrial interests, by historical grievances, and by the absence of any mechanism for de-escalation or negotiated settlement. And here is where Africa enters the picture again. Africa is not a theater in the American-Iranian conflict in the way the Middle East is. But Africa is vulnerable to the consequences of that conflict. When oil prices spike, African nations that import oil experience economic shock. When global trade is disrupted, African nations dependent on exports experience reduced demand and reduced revenue. When militaries across the continent are called upon to support one side or the other, they are diverted from their primary function of providing security and stability to their own nations. Uganda is one node in this system, but it is not isolated. Across the continent, military leadership is being cultivated by external powers, being offered relationships, being positioned for future conflicts. And across the continent, populations are paying the price through economic instability and compromised state capacity. Let us consider now what it would mean if Uganda actually committed troops to a war in the Middle East. The psychological impact would be immediate. Uganda's military would be fighting under foreign command, in a foreign land, for foreign strategic interests. The soldiers would be exposed to risks they did not sign up for, not the existential security risks of defending their own nation, but the tactical risks of being inserted into a theater where the primary combatants have incentives to minimize their own casualties. Historically, when African troops are deployed in foreign conflicts, they often absorb disproportionate casualties while bearing less of the strategic benefit. But the deeper impact would be political. If Uganda's military is visible in the Middle East fighting Iran, Uganda becomes a target for Iranian proxies and sympathizers. Uganda's embassies, its business interests, its nationals abroad become potential points of retaliation. The conflict that was distant becomes proximate. The war that was happening somewhere else suddenly has a direct connection to Ugandan security, and the domestic impact would be transformative. When a nation's military is committed externally, it cannot be committed internally. The troops deployed to the Middle East are troops not available for border security, not available for responding to internal instability, not available for supporting civilian authority in moments of crisis. If Uganda experiences a security emergency, a refugee crisis, a border incursion, an internal uprising, its military capacity would be reduced by the number of troops committed externally. This is not abstract. Uganda has experienced refugee crises. Uganda has refugee camps housing hundreds of thousands of people fleeing South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Uganda has border security challenges. Uganda has internal stability concerns. Every soldier sent to the Middle East is a soldier not available for these pressing domestic challenges. The resource impact would compound this. Military deployment is expensive. It requires logistics, communications, medical support, and training. Those resources come from somewhere. In a nation with limited state capacity, resources directed to Middle Eastern deployment are resources not available for domestic security, infrastructure, or social services. The political impact might be the most significant. Military deployment abroad, especially in foreign conflicts, tends to concentrate power in the military leadership. The military becomes more important to national security. Military spending becomes more justified. Military views on national strategy become more influential. And in nations where military leadership already has outsized influence in politics, this further tilts the balance away from civilian authority and democratic accountability. Uganda has a history of military dominance in politics. The current president, Yoweri Museveni, rose to power through military means and has relied on military loyalty to maintain his grip. If Uganda's military becomes even more central to national strategy and even more involved in external conflicts, the implications for democratic governance would be dire. This is what the speaker means when he critiques this decision not just as a matter of foreign policy, but as a matter of national interest. It is not that supporting Israel is inherently wrong or irrational. It is that the specific form that support takes, military deployment in a foreign conflict, comes with domestic consequences that far exceed the strategic benefit to Uganda itself. There is another layer to this that deserves attention: the question of why this is happening now, and what it reveals about the state of international competition for African alignment. The African continent has become a strategic prize. As traditional great power competition has intensified, the United States competing with China for global influence, Russia seeking to maintain great power status, India rising as a counterweight to China in Asia, Africa has become a terrain where these competitions play out. Every great power wants African votes at the United Nations. Every great power wants African military bases or military partnerships. Every great power wants African resources and African markets. Uganda, in this context, is being courted by multiple powers. The United States wants Uganda to be a reliable African ally. Israel wants Uganda to be an African voice supporting Israel. China wants Uganda to invest in Chinese infrastructure and accept Chinese military training. Russia wants Uganda to be sympathetic to Russian interests in global forums. And Uganda's military leadership sees opportunity in this competition, playing different powers against each other, extracting benefits and aid from multiple sources. The consideration of committing troops to support Israel appears in this context. It is a signal to the United States that Uganda is a reliable partner. It is a way of deepening military relationship with Israel and by extension with the United States. It is a way of positioning Uganda as important to Western interests in Africa. And it may come with tangible benefits, military aid, training opportunities, intelligence sharing, or other forms of security partnership. But here is the critical point. Uganda is not the only nation being courted. Ethiopia is being courted. Kenya is being courted. Nigeria is being courted. And when multiple nations are being offered similar partnerships, those partnerships have less value. The United States cannot reward all of Africa for being pro-American. The rewards would be meaningless. Israel cannot give military aid to every nation that supports it. The aid would be spread too thin. So what emerges is a hierarchy, a competition among African nations for greater alignment, deeper partnership, more generous benefits from external powers. Uganda's military leadership appears to have concluded that deeper commitment, potentially including military deployment, is necessary to secure greater benefits. This is rational within a certain logic, but it is the logic of competition for scraps from a table that is not Uganda's own. Now let us address the elephant in the room, the question of stability in the broader Middle Eastern context, and what happens if a full-scale Israeli-Iranian war actually occurs. The scenario that keeps strategy awake at night is one where Israel conducts a major strike on Iranian nuclear and military infrastructure. Iran retaliates across its full range of capabilities, and the United States is drawn directly into the conflict. In such a scenario, American bases across the region would be targeted. American naval assets would be in danger. American troops on the ground in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia would face direct attack. The scale of such a conflict would dwarf anything that has occurred in the Middle East in recent decades. The economic consequences would be catastrophic. Oil prices would spike not by 20 or 30%, but potentially by 50 or more percent. Global shipping through the Strait of Hormuz would be disrupted. Global financial markets would experience severe shock. Recessions in developed economies are not impossible. In developing economies, the consequences would be severe depression, unemployment, and social unrest. And Africa would be ground zero for many of these consequences. African nations dependent on oil imports would face energy crises. African nations dependent on food imports would face price shocks and potential famines. African nations with fragile currencies would experience capital flight and currency collapses. The entire development agenda for the continent, the effort to reduce poverty, expand education, build infrastructure, would be set back by years. This is what is at stake when Uganda's military considers committing to a foreign conflict. Not an abstract strategic choice, but the material well-being of Uganda's population and the entire continent. The speaker makes the case that this is not being considered. Uganda's leadership is not weighing the domestic consequences of committing to a foreign war. It is not asking what happens to Uganda if that war disrupts global oil markets. It is not calculating the probability of Iranian retaliation against Ugandan interests. It is making a decision based on immediate strategic partnership benefits while ignoring downstream costs. This is partly because those downstream costs are not immediate. They will manifest months or years later as economic pressures that get blamed on other causes. It is partly because military leadership has insulated itself from those costs. Soldiers will bear some risk, but military leadership will benefit from the prestige and resources that come with military deployment. And it is partly because the decision-making process is not transparent or democratic. So the Ugandan public is not being asked for consent. Here is where we arrive at the fundamental question that the input raises. Who should decide what Africa's strategic priorities are? The current system is one where African military leadership, often working in opaque coordination with Western powers, make strategic decisions on behalf of their nations. Those decisions are presented as necessary, as inevitable, as beneficial to the nation. But the actual process of decision-making is not democratic or transparent. The public is not consulted. The costs are not clearly articulated. The benefits are not equally distributed. An alternative would be one where African nations conduct their own strategic assessments based on their own interests. Uganda could ask, what are Uganda's security threats? The answer is primarily internal instability and regional conflicts that could produce refugee flows. Those are threats that require domestic military capacity. Uganda could ask, what are Uganda's economic priorities? The answer is poverty reduction, food security, and development. Those are priorities that require resources not committed to external conflicts. Uganda could ask, what are Uganda's political priorities? The answer should be democratic governance, rule of law, and accountability. Those are priorities that military deployment abroad tends to undermine. If Uganda conducted such an assessment, would it conclude that committing troops to a war in the Middle East is in its interests? The case seems weak. The strategic benefit to Uganda is marginal. The costs to Uganda are substantial. The primary beneficiary of such a commitment is not Uganda, but the external powers that are seeking to expand their influence and capability in a region of strategic importance. This is not to say that Uganda should isolate itself or refuse all military partnerships with external powers. That is neither realistic nor desirable. But it suggests that Uganda should be more selective, more careful, and more transparent about those partnerships. It should conduct cost-benefit analyses that are rigorous and honest. It should ensure that military decisions are made through democratic processes with public input and accountability. And it should prioritize its own security and development over the strategic interests of distant powers. As we near the end of this analysis, let us consider what this moment represents in the broader trajectory of African geopolitics. Africa is increasingly asserting its agency in international affairs. African nations are diversifying their partnerships rather than remaining locked into Cold War-era alignments. African trade is increasingly inter-African rather than extractive flows to the West. African voices are increasingly heard in international forums. There are real movements toward African strategic autonomy, but those movements are fragile, and they are being tested right now by external powers seeking to re-establish their influence, and by internal elites who benefit from external alignment over domestic accountability. The question of whether Uganda's military commits to supporting Israel in a war with Iran is, in this context, a test case. It is a question about whether African nations will make their own strategic calculations, or whether they will continue to be pawns in other powers' games. It is a question about whether military leadership will prioritize national interest or external partnership. It is a question about whether Africa will move toward genuine autonomy or whether it will remain subordinate to forces that see it as terrain rather than as home. The speaker frames this as mental colonization, and the language is harsh, but it is not inaccurate. When African leaders are willing to commit their nation's resources to foreign conflicts in which their nations have no stake, they are operating within a colonial framework. The framework that says Africa's primary function is to serve external powers. That framework is no longer formally imposed. It is internalized, self-perpetuating, justified through language of partnership and strategic necessity. Breaking that framework requires more than rhetorical commitment to African unity or African solidarity. It requires actual recalibration of how African nations make strategic decisions. It requires transparency, accountability, and democratic input. It requires military leadership that sees its primary duty as protecting its own nation rather than serving external powers. It requires political leadership that will prioritize development and stability over prestige and external validation. So what happens next? That is the question that should linger with you as this analysis concludes. Uganda may or may not commit troops to support Israel. The decision may already be made in backroom negotiations, or it may be contingent on developments in the Middle East or shifts in American strategy. But the underlying dynamics will not change. African nations will continue to face pressure from external powers to align with their strategic interests. Military leadership across the continent will continue to calculate how external partnerships can benefit them. And ordinary people will continue to bear the costs of decisions made in their name, but not for their benefit. Whether this trajectory continues or whether it shifts depends on choices that African leadership will make in the coming months and years. It depends on whether there are political forces willing to challenge military dominance of foreign policy. It depends on whether there is sufficient public pressure to demand transparency and accountability. It depends on whether African nations can coordinate on issues of common interest rather than competing for external validation. It depends, ultimately, on whether African agency is real or whether it remains subordinate to the interests of distant powers. The specifics of Uganda's decision matter less than what it represents, a choice point in a larger trajectory. Will Africa move toward genuine strategic autonomy, or will it continue in subordination? That question will shape the continent's development, security, and political future for decades. And right now, that question is being answered not in grand proclamations or strategic documents, but in quiet military negotiations that few people see and fewer people understand. This is the cost of misaligned priorities. This is what it looks like when distant wars become local problems. And this is what it means when African interests take a backseat to the strategic games of more powerful nations.